right, welcome back to another episode of the Psychopedia podcast. I'm your host, Investigator Slater. It's another gray day here in New York, which generally I love. I love the dark days. I love the rainy days, but we are going on day like 5 or 6 in a row maybe, and it's starting to get to me. And firefighter Dave, who actually has seasonal affective disorder, so it's been like a lot of fun in my house lately. I do have to tease firefighter Dave for a minute. I did ask him if it was okay if I did this, because I never want to embarrass him or step over some line that might make him feel dumb or whatever. And I rarely have anything not negative, but ridiculous to say about firefighter Dave because he's such an elevated human. So when something happens, I have a lot of fun with it. So we were in the car yesterday and we did drive-through coffee, all right? So we're chit-chatting normally, as we have been doing for the last 20 years, using our normal voices, being normal people. And he rolls down his window to order his coffee and he's like, "Hey, can I get a coffee with extra soy?" I was like, what the fuck? Who was that? Why did you do this weird voice? And he goes, I thought he was going to defend it. I thought he was going to be like, what weird voice? What are you talking about? He goes, I just don't want to come across as too excited when I'm ordering my coffee. So he puts on a fake persona. Is that insane? Honestly, it was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen and heard, and he's never going to live it down. Yeah, hey, can I get a coffee, extra soy? All right, swag, sure. Anyway, hi guys. If it is your first time here, welcome. If it is your 100 and millionth whatever time here, welcome home, freak. This will always be your home. It will always be my home. It's our happy place, is it not? It's my happy place. I want to tell you guys, because you're obviously a bunch of true crime people, what I did last night very quickly. I don't want to give you too much ado, but it was really interesting, and I think you guys will appreciate hearing it. I met Mr. Ballin in New York City, and he gave sort of I don't want to call it a master class, but it is kind of a good word for it. He and his sister, who works with him in all that he does, really. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist / writer. So she does writing for him and research, which amazing that he has not only his sister, but a woman of that caliber on his team. Incredible. And he kind of gave this masterclass on storytelling and his process. And it was so interesting. And it was really cool to meet him. So I'm going to probably be all over it trying to establish a collab between Psychopedia and Mr. Ballin. So Mr. Ballin, I'm putting you on notice. You're going to have to do it. But it was really interesting stuff. And he and I would say, have very similar styles in how we like to write and how we like to weave a story. It was just very cool meeting him. Really, really nice guy. I just want to mention that if you love what I'm doing here and you want more of it and you want about a million other different types of things, different types of content that I'm creating, stuff that Tony Tennessee, my producer, is involved in, if you want to get directly involved with co-hosting as my guest a Patreon episode, I have a place for you to go where you can do that. And that is patreon.com/psychopediapod. Really fun. If you want to be my guest co-host, we have a sign-up sheet. You have to be on the Semen Demon tier. Go do it because the list is huge and getting bigger by the day, thankfully. So do it, add your name, and let's hang out. And while we're on the topic of Patreon, I want to go over a few names, give these people their propers. So let me just take you through 3 or 4 of them. We have Grammy D, which personally I love because I used to call my grandma Grammy, and she's the one who got me into true crime. So shout out to you, Grammy D / Grammy in heaven. There's Corpse Kebab, which is a nod to the Joe Matheny serial griller case that came out a couple weeks ago. Raquel Rubin, I like the alliteration there, so I chose you. And the last one that I want to read, which I don't know, this one tickles me. This one I appreciate. Lost the titties, got the pitties. I mean, brilliant. Because I try and end these episodes now with a palate cleanser like you guys are used to having. And generally that palate cleanser is in the form of my dog Cash, who's a pity. One last thing, but this is on the subject of the case we are covering today. Okay, so I like to have my ear to the ground in terms of what's happening in the world. And to the extent that I can raise awareness on issues that I think are important, I try and do that. So June is National Indigenous History Month in Canada, which culminates with National Indigenous Peoples Day on June 21st. And I felt really strongly about raising awareness about the disproportionately high number of missing and murdered Indigenous individuals in British Columbia, Canada, mostly, by the way, women and girls. And I wanted to do that by covering a case that highlights the ongoing crisis and the systemic issues that continue to affect Indigenous communities. The more that I dove into this case, the more I realized how deep the pain runs and how much more needs to be done. So this is not just a story, it's a call for action. And it's long overdue that these voices are heard and that their stories are told. So I want to thank you guys in advance for listening and respecting the subject matter. And with that, let's just get into it. There's a 2-lane stretch of highway that slices through the rugged expanse of northern British Columbia like an open wound. Over 435 miles of jagged, unforgiving road, flanked by the suffocating embrace of ancient forests and the vast, unbroken sky. It winds through the land like a serpent, its asphalt cracked and scarred by time, its curves like the slow, treacherous breath of a beast waiting in the dark. The surrounding towns are so small you might miss them altogether. A blink and they vanish, leaving only memories of lives lived in quiet desperation. But to some, this highway is more than just a route to somewhere else. It's a graveyard for the living, a place where daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends vanish into the shadows, swallowed whole by the hands of those who prey upon them. For years, their disappearances along this highway were dismissed, brushed aside, written off as isolated tragedies, unfortunate coincidences, nothing more, nothing less. But the families and community knew the truth. They felt the pattern, the pull of something sinister beneath the surface. The victims too similar, their fates too alike, the location too cursed. And the silence from authorities, it wasn't just deafening, it was suffocating. Because this is no ordinary highway. This is the Highway of Tears. The Highway of Tears is a stretch of Yellowhead Highway 16 that runs from the coastal town of Prince Rupert to the central city of Prince George in British Columbia, Canada. And it's a microcosm or the nucleus of a national tragedy facing Indigenous people in Canada who are far more likely to face violence than any other segment of the population. And Indigenous women are 6 times more likely to be murdered than non-Indigenous women. Human Rights Watch has identified British Columbia as the epicenter of unsolved murders of Indigenous women and girls in Canada, which is a staggering and grim statistic. So the Indigenous peoples of British Columbia have lived in this area for more than 14,000 years, and that's a conservative estimate. Since the 18th century, when European settlers began moving into the land now known as British Columbia, as of 2021, 290,210 Indigenous people live in the province, speaking more than 30 First Nations languages and nearly 60 dialects. These languages are just one facet of a rich cultural heritage that includes diverse traditions, art, storytelling, spiritual practices, and unique systems of governance. Indigenous communities in British Columbia have a deep connection to the land, with each group maintaining its own distinct relationship to the environment, as well as sacred sites and seasonal cycles passed down through generations. However, despite this vibrant and impressive cultural legacy, Indigenous peoples continue to face pervasive discrimination. And this bias is not just an echo from the past. It's not just decades. It is deeply embedded in contemporary society as well. Indigenous peoples in British Columbia and across all of Canada are disproportionately affected by poverty, lack of access to education and healthcare, and systemic inequality. They face higher rates of violence, including sexual violence and domestic abuse, and are often treated as second-class citizens by mainstream institutions. Listen to this. The unemployment rate is as high as 92% in some First Nations reserves. The ongoing exploitation and marginalization are compounded by the historical trauma of colonialism, as well as forced assimilation and displacement from their land. The systemic discrimination extends to the criminal justice system as well, where Indigenous people are overrepresented, often receiving harsher sentences than their non-Indigenous counterparts for similar offenses. Law enforcement and government policies frequently fail to protect Indigenous women and girls in particular, contributing to the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And this discrimination is not just about statistics or policies. It's about human lives and a history that continues to leave its mark on entire communities, perpetuating cycles of violence and oppression that many are still struggling to break free from today. The Highway of Tears runs through 23 First Nations communities. The enormous stretch of roadway is mostly isolated and flanked by dense brush and thick forests, and lacks lighting and traffic cameras. And this is nuts. Until 2017, residents of the area had no public transportation. So for decades, the lack of reliable public transportation forced many locals to walk along the highway in hopes of being able to hitch a ride from a passing driver. What was a matter of necessity for many, too many, became a dangerous gamble that almost, I won't say always, it often ended in tragedy, a death sentence born from a choice they had no real option but to make. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the RCMP henceforth, nice, has estimated that approximately 1,200 Indigenous women have been murdered or have gone missing across Canada, with about 1,000 of those being homicide victims. However, Indigenous groups who have spent years collecting names and details about missing women argue that this figure is actually misleading. The Native Women's Association of Canada has documented over 4,000 cases. As for the stretch of highway known as the Highway of Tears between 1969 and 2006, the RCMP acknowledges only 18 women and girls who were murdered or disappeared. And these women and girls were the subject of an investigation launched by the RCMP in 2005 called Project EPANA. 10 out of the 18 victims were Indigenous women and girls. But Indigenous groups argue that this number is misleading because it reflects only the disappearances and murders that have happened in the specific geographic areas around certain highways, and that the real number in northern British Columbia exceeds 80. So the name EPANA comes from the RCMP's E Division, which covers British Columbia, and Pana, which is the Inuit goddess who oversees souls. And the task force's main objective was to determine if a serial killer or multiple killers were behind the deaths and disappearances. In terms of the investigation itself, of those murdered, only 2 cases have been officially solved. Okay, so here's how I'd like to lay out the rest of this episode. We're going to go through the cases of 13 girls and women who were confirmed to have been killed. For each one, we're going to explore what happened or what may have happened, because saying their names and telling their stories matters. It's how we ensure that they're remembered not just as statistics, but as human beings who were loved, valued, and deeply missed by their families and communities. I want to be transparent with you guys. This next section might get a little disorienting at times. It might feel a little dicey. I'm going to be moving between different locations, referencing a lot of names, obviously, and trying to connect details that don't always fit neatly together. It is what it is. Some of these girls and women have known killers. Some have suspected ones. And others, no one's ever been held accountable for. A few of the cases appear to be linked, possibly by geography, by timing, or possibly by a shared killer, but many stand hauntingly alone. And that complexity, the blurred lines, the unresolved questions, is actually part of the devastation. So while it's going to feel possibly overwhelming at different points, that confusion is also part of the truth. It reflects the chaos of the investigation, the pain of the families, and the systemic failures that have allowed so many of these cases to remain in the shadows for so long. That said, obviously, I'm going to do my best to present this as clearly as possible and to intertwine elements of the investigation where it makes sense. Because again, details matter. And honoring these women and girls means sitting with the discomfort, walking through the confusion, and refusing to look away. So again, right now, we're going to examine the 13 girls and women along the Highway of Tears whose deaths have been officially confirmed by the RCMP. Okay, let's begin. The first confirmed murdered victim was a 27-year-old woman named Gloria Moody, who was killed in 1969. Gloria, who went by the name Lavina, so I'm going to be calling her Lavina moving forward, is the first known Indigenous woman to have been murdered along the infamous Highway of Tears. A mother of 2 young children, ages 4 and 3, Lavina was kind, caring, and deeply cherished by her 8 siblings, parents, and extended family. Her brother, David Moody, who went by the name Al, who was 21 years old when Lavina passed, described her as being fun-loving and always ready to joke around with her many friends. In October of 1969, Lavina went on a family trip with her mom, Daisy, her dad, David, and her brother, Al. And they headed to Williams Lake to do some Christmas shopping and to get out of Bella Coola for a couple of days. While they were out and about, or oot and a boot, since it's Canada, I don't mean any disrespect. I'm just having fun. I have an accent too. I'm from New York. If you haven't noticed, we can have fun with each other. The family noticed a man staring at Lavina, which made her visibly uncomfortable. Her family remembers her being uncomfortable. In fact, Lavina's unease grew so intense that her brother Al eventually confronted the man to ask why he was staring at her sister. And the man just casually replied that it was because Lavina was so beautiful. The family decided to leave, and later that day, they arrived in Williams Lake, where they checked into the Ranch Hotel for the weekend. On the Saturday night of their stay, Lavina and Al went to the Lakeview pub to unwind and have a drink, right? Because they were on vacation. It was a busy time in town with what was known as a pay weekend due to a large livestock sale, meaning that the bars and the hotels were bustling. I guess at some point, Al returned back to the hotel, but Lavina never did. When she failed to return to the hotel, Lavina's family notified the RCMP, but before an official report could even be filed, they received devastating news. Hunters discovered Lavina's naked body on a trail about 7 miles west of Williams Lake. According to the RCMP's official 1969 report, Lavina had been brutally beaten, tortured, and sexually assaulted, with part of the heinous sexual assault involving a tree branch. She ultimately bled to death from the injury. The report lists her death as a case of second-degree murder. Now, in 2021, the RCMP confirmed that Lavina Moody's case remains open, pending resolution through the judicial system, meaning someone must be charged for the case in order for it to be closed. In 1999, Lavina's daughter, Vanessa, was informed by the Williams Lake RCMP that strong evidence, including witness reports, actually led them to identify a suspect, a man named Al Blom, among other suspects. However, by that time, all the suspects, and they had 3 in total, were already deceased. Now, RCMP reports spanning from 1970 to 2010 suggest that some suspects were even questioned and given polygraph tests, whatever the fuck polygraph tests revealed. Former RCMP officer Mel McIntosh, who was assigned to Lavina's case in the late 1980s, recalls how disorganized the investigation was. When McIntosh took over the case in 1988, he found Lavina's file in absolute chaos, like total disarray, loose papers, unclear statements, and no identifiers. McIntosh learned from another officer that there were actual bullets found near Lavina's body and an expensive rifle that a potential suspect had recently disposed of, but the officer had no notes to support this claim. Ultimately, the bullets and the rifle could have been vital leads that, if properly documented and investigated, might have helped uncover critical details about the case, such as the identity of the perpetrator or the circumstances surrounding Lavina's disappearance. Because chances are, or I'll say likely, that gun and those bullets were related to her disappearance. Did the perpetrator use a gun to force Lavina into his car? Did the bullets found at the scene match those from other crime scenes? The fact that there were no supporting notes or evidence to back these claims is mind-boggling. McIntosh noted that the disregard for the case was more of a sign of the times rather than any ethnic motive, meaning he chalked it up basically to poor record keeping and lack of professionalism. Having said that, he did recall that some Mounties did indeed display ethnic bias, which is very uncool, which further compounded the failure to properly investigate the case. And that obviously is a huge theme of this case, right? That investigative ethnic bias. Still, with all of that considered, McIntosh indicated that they did have leads between 1988 and 1990. He learned that a woman named Toni Brecknock, who came forward to indicate that she feared for her safety after a violent relationship with suspect Al Blom, came forward after Blom's death with a letter that suggested Blom actually confessed to killing Lavina. She also described Blom as extremely violent and reported that he had committed quote-unquote demented sexually violent acts on her and that she'd been too fearful to come forward or speak out during his lifetime, even though he confessed to her that he killed Lavina. Additionally, an RCMP officer reportedly told an investigator that Blom had made a deathbed confession to his brother and sister, stating that he was responsible for the murder. Pop quiz. Are deathbed confessions admissible in court in Canada? A, yes, always. It's considered a quote-unquote dying right to usher justice. B, sometimes, if the person believes death is imminent and the statement pertains to the cause of their death. C, no, they are never admissible. D, only if the confession is made to an attorney, priest, or law enforcement officer. All right, guys, go. The answer is B. Sometimes, if the person believes death is imminent, so they're really on their deathbed, and that the statement pertains to the cause of their death. Now, I had to look this up because I found that wording very confusing. Like, what does that mean? The statement pertains to the cause of their death? Like, the death of the person they're confessing to killing is relating somehow to their own death? Very confusing wording, in my opinion. Basically, it just means that they are confessing while facing death themselves. So in Canada, deathbed confessions can be admissible under the dying declaration rule, which is an exception to the general hearsay rule. So despite all of these allegations and confessions, Al Blom was never formally charged or convicted in connection with Gloria Lavina Moody's death. And the investigation into Lavina's murder continued to remain marked by silence and community reluctance to speak out. According to the Moody family, many in the small town of Williams Lake knew who the killer was but were too afraid to come forward, either to protect the man or men involved, or out of fear of retaliation. Therefore, beautiful Gloria Lavina Moody's case remains unsolved to this day. Okay, the next young woman on our list here is 18-year-old Micheline Pear, who was killed in 1970. Micheline Pear was just 18 years old, stood 5 feet 4 inches with brown hair, and was wearing blue flare cords when she disappeared. Originally from Quebec, Micheline was in the Hudson's Hope area of British Columbia at the time of her disappearance. Micheline was last seen hitchhiking through the region. Police reports indicate that 2 women gave her a ride before dropping her off at the gates of Tompkins Ranch on Highway 20, which is located between Fort St. John and Hudson's Hope. On August 8, 1970, Micheline's body was found about 21 kilometers away by a group of people picking berries along the highway. Authorities determined that she'd been beaten with a blunt object, and although her body was too decomposed to confirm, they also suspected that she'd been sexually assaulted. Beautiful Micheline Pear's case remains unsolved to this day. The next young woman on our list is 19-year-old Gail Ways, killed in 1974. Gail Ways was the second oldest of 9 siblings living in Kamloops, British Columbia with her family. Her siblings remember her as independent, funny, and fiercely protective. Her mother, Rona Ways, remembers her daughter as a shining light, kind-hearted, radiant, and always upbeat. On October 19, 1973, Gail was last seen finishing her shift as a service station attendant. She was trying to get home to her parents' house in Kamloops that night, and she needed a ride. Now, a man named Ron Hagerman, who was a local banker, recalled seeing Gail in the David Thompson pub where she also worked, asking if anyone could give her a lift. Her plan, according to Ron, had been to hitchhike 120 kilometers south to Kamloops to apply to the Canada Manpower Center there, which, as I understand it, was a government job recruitment service at the time. Unfortunately, that would never happen, because it is believed that Gail eventually did find a ride and, sadly, has not been seen since. Her remains were eventually discovered in a water-filled ditch off Highway 5 the next year on April 4th, 1974. Gail was found naked and her clothing has never been recovered. But in 2012, police announced that they had a possible suspect in Gail's murder, a now deceased U.S. convict named Bobby Jack Fowler. Here's the deal with Bobby Jack Fowler. Before we can connect him to Gail Weiss, let me start out by explaining that Canadian authorities have definitively linked Bobby Jack Fowler to the 1974 killing of 16-year-old Colleen McMillan, who actually appears as the fourth victim on our heartbreaking list here that we are going through. So these cases get a little bit intertwined. I'm going to try and keep it organized and tight to keep everything clear. Okay, so we're talking about Gail Weiss, but now we're talking a little bit as well about Colleen McMillan. DNA tests ultimately confirmed that Fowler was Colleen's killer, which actually marked the oldest DNA hit in Interpol's history, which I found fascinating. This breakthrough was possible thanks to the RCMP's preservation of Colleen's blouse, which contained DNA evidence when her body was discovered. While DNA testing wasn't an option in 1974, investigators carefully stored the blouse and then decades later re-examined it as DNA technology advanced. In 2007, the sample was entered into criminal databases, though initially it actually yielded no solid leads, only that the DNA belonged to an unknown male who was presumed to have been Colleen's killer. But as forensic science continued to improve over time, the sample was further enhanced and sent to Interpol. And then in May 2012, the RCMP received confirmation that the DNA matched none other than Bobby Jack Fowler. So, who was this guy? Bobby Jack Fowler was a Texas-born, twice-divorced, father of four shit-sane, described as a man who could be charming but often violent, which obviously, in flashing lights, psychopath, psychopath, psychopath. He lived a nomadic lifestyle, took odd construction jobs, stayed in dingy hotels, drove cheap cars, frequented small-town bars, and had a penchant for picking up hitchhikers. Fowler's criminal record was extensive as well and included charges for arson, DUI, multiple DUIs if I recall correctly, theft, and violent assaults. Fowler was convicted in 1996 for kidnapping and assaulting a woman in Oregon who narrowly escaped by jumping from a second-story window, completely naked, with a rope still tied around her ankle. Fowler's violent history and nomadic lifestyle, which took him across Canada and the U.S., has tied him to multiple cases, including Colleen's. Right? We know that now definitively because of the DNA. Fowler died in prison in 2006, but before his death, he was linked to other murders. And he remains a suspect in the deaths of Gail Weiss, as well as another young woman who appears as the fifth woman on our list, and that is Pamela Darlington. Now, all of their remains, Gail, Colleen, and Pamela, were discovered within the same year. They all had striking physical similarities to each other, very distinct strawberry blonde/reddish hair, and all were found within a 200-kilometer radius of one another. Fowler is also linked to 4 unsolved murders along the Oregon coast in the 1990s, so Fowler's connection to Canada, specifically to Colleen, Gail, and Pamela, stems from his work as a transient roofer in 1974. So are all 3 of these girls and women, Gail, Colleen, and Pamela, who were all part of the 13 confirmed homicides on the Highway of Tears, possibly the work of serial killer Bobby Jack Fowler? Yeah, it seems likely. Police are working to trace a 40-year timeline of Fowler's movements, but are still seeking more information from the public, particularly about his time in British Columbia. Fowler had a distorted view of women and believed that many desired violent sexual assault, which just adds another horrifying layer to this already horrific case, which I'm going to punctuate here with a pop quiz. What has the media referred to Fowler as? A, the hidden Ted Bundy. B, the ghost of Highway 16. C, the silent reaper. 5 seconds. The answer is A, the hidden Ted Bundy. Now, just 3 weeks after Gail went missing, the remains of 19-year-old Pamela Darlington were discovered in a park. Pam, as she was fondly called, was born on October 21st, 1954. Unfortunately, not much is known about Pam or her homicide, though it was determined that she had indeed been sexually assaulted prior to being beaten to death. The last reported sighting of Pamela was at a bar in downtown Kamloops on November 6, 1973. Then, on November 7th, Pam's remains were discovered by a boy named Frank Almond, who'd been walking his dog through a nearby park near the South Thompson River that flowed nearby. And of course, we know that Bobby Jack Fowler is believed to have been the one to have taken Pam's innocent, precious life. Okay, you guys with me? Again, I know there's a ton of information being dispensed, a whirlwind of names and locations, theories, but that's the reality of this story. It's not clean, it's not linear, and it sure as hell isn't simple. But the volume of detail is the evidence. So hang in. Every puzzle piece adds weight to the bigger picture. Okay, the sixth girl on our list is 15-year-old Monica Ignace, killed in 1974. Monica was just 14 years old when she disappeared. Monica was last seen on the night of December 13th, 1974 at around 11 p.m., walking alone along Highway 16, heading toward her home. Now, she was wearing a blue wool duffel coat, blue socks, and brown wallaby-style shoes, and she never made it home that night. 4 months later, on April 6th, Monica's body was found 6 kilometers northeast of Terrace off a densely wooded service road called Kelgar. Her body was decomposed and partially clothed, and authorities determined that she'd been strangled with her own coat. According to authorities, one of her blue socks was never found. 2 witnesses reported seeing a car containing a man and what appeared to be a small girl, who's now speculated to have been Monica, pulled over to the side of the road the night she vanished. As of now, no arrests have ever been made in her case, and it remains unsolved. The next girl on our list is 12-year-old Monica Jack, killed in 1978. Monica Jack was last seen riding her bike on May 6, 1978, on the quiet highway between Merritt and her family home on the Kilshina Reserve. It was 2 weeks before her 13th birthday. She was wearing a pink floral shirt and brown corduroys at the time of her death. Initially reported missing by her parents, her bike was found a day later. However, and this is so devastating, it took 17 years for her remains to be located when her skull and bones were found by a forestry worker on a mountain in the area. Now, a man named Gary Taylor Handlin was indeed convicted for Monica's murder in 2019 after confessing to the crime 4 decades after he committed it to an undercover cop wearing a wire as part of an elaborate RCMP sting operation nicknamed Mr. Big. As part of his confession to this fake crime boss, who was really an undercover cop, Gary said the following: "I remember picking up a broad one time, having sex, then I just lost it for some reason. I think I strangled her. I'm not sure. All I know is she was Indian." End quote. At one point, the undercover officer told Gary, like in an effort to, he was trying to relate to Gary, I guess to keep him talking. And he said something like, "Hey, I'm sure it was really hard for you to talk about, the fact that you killed someone." And Gary replied that, yeah, it was. It was hard to talk about it, but it's also a load off my chest having finally told someone. The officer then asked Gary if he'd ever told anybody else, to which Gary responded, quote, "Nobody knows unless, you're taping me." Idiot. Because he was being taped. Needless to say, Gary Taylor Handlin was sentenced to life in prison for the first-degree murder of Monica Jack with no chance of parole for 15 years. He's also a suspect, by the way, in the 1975 murder of an 11-year-old girl named Catherine Mary Herbert. Monica Jack's mother remembers her as a beautiful girl with a distinctive laugh who was loved by relatives, friends, and teachers. And, in her case, thankfully, somebody was caught, convicted, and thrown in prison. A little bit of closure, I hope, for her family. I don't think it ever takes the pain away, but hopefully it can bring some sort of closure. The 8th woman here on our list is 33-year-old Maureen Mosey, killed in 1981. So Maureen Mosey was murdered on May 8th, 1981. She was last seen hitchhiking from Salmon Arm, and her body was found the next day at the intersection of Highway 97 and Highway 1 near Kamloops. Multiple tracks were found in the area, but one set in particular is believed to have belonged to the killer. In fact, a witness actually helped police create a sketch of Maureen getting into a greenish-blue quote-unquote junker car with an Alberta license plate hanging from the front bumper, no rear plate, and a dangling tailpipe. The driver was in his late 20s or 30s, had dark brown hair, collar length, and had a 2-week-old beard on his face. At the time of her death, Maureen was wearing beaded moccasins and was carrying a tan-colored canvas handbag. Unfortunately, we don't know too much more about Maureen. Although I did see a comment somewhere in some forum in my research, someone indicated that they were her cousin and that Maureen is still dearly missed. However, her case remains unsolved to this day. The 9th victim on our list is 24-year-old Alberta Williams, killed in 1989. Alberta Williams was a member of the Gitineau Nation from Gitineau, British Columbia. Known for her kindness and shyness as a child, Alberta matured into a compassionate young woman who loved life and saw the world as a positive place. She was content with whatever came her way. Her siblings, however, often felt that she trusted people too easily, and as such, they were always a bit overprotective of her. Now, Alberta was last seen at a Popeyes in downtown Prince Rupert by her sister on August 26, 1989. Her body was later discovered on September 25, 1989. She was naked, had been sexually assaulted, and strangled to death. Her case remains unsolved to this day. The next girl on our list showing up as the 10th victim is Ayla Sarek Ager, killed in 2006. On Thursday, February 2nd, 2006, Ayla, her sister Kyla, and their brother Tim spent the day at Pine Center Mall, located just 4 kilometers from home. While there, Ayla and Kyla met friends and decided to go out drinking. Tim chose to head home, leaving his sisters at the mall. And what happened next remains a mystery. At some point, Ayla and Kyla were separated. Kyla returned home the next morning expecting Ayla to be there, but she was missing. So the family spent the day retracing their steps, searching for any sign of her, but found nothing. By Friday morning, Ayla's mother, Audrey, reported her missing, but the police advised her to wait 78 hours before filing a report. On February 10th, nearly a week after Ayla was last seen, a motorist found her body in a ditch off Highway 16, about 23 kilometers east of Prince George. She was found without any clothing or belongings, except for a necklace that Audrey recognized as one that she had given to her daughter. An autopsy revealed that Ayla had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Police suggested that she had gone to a friend's house to get a ride home, but then ended up walking toward a house known for drug use when the ride fell through. Despite investigating several leads, including surveillance footage showing her heading toward home and a black van that she was seen getting into, no arrests have been made, and the case remains unsolved to this day. The next 3 individuals appear to be connected in terms of potential killers, so I'm going to present their cases as a group, because to separate them would be to miss the bigger picture, I think. And these 3 individuals are Ramona Wilson, Roxanne Thyara, and Alicia Germain. And together, these 3 cases formed a chilling pattern and together helped to push law enforcement to launch Project EPANA. They were the impetus for the creation of that task force. Ramona Wilson, Roxanne Thyara, and Alicia Germain were 3 Indigenous girls, all teenagers, all living in northern British Columbia, all murdered in 1994, and all found near or along the Highway of Tears. Chillingly, all remain unsolved. Their stories are heartbreakingly similar, not only in how their lives ended, but in also how they were lived. Each faced systemic vulnerabilities, periods of instability, and the daily realities of being young, Indigenous, and female in a country that has long failed to protect those most at risk. Ramona Wilson was 16 years old, a member of the Gitskin Nation. She was the youngest of 6 siblings and had dreams of becoming a psychologist. She also wanted to be the first in her family to go to university. So on June 11, 1994, she left her home in Smithers, British Columbia, and was last seen hitchhiking. 10 months later, her body was found in a wooded area west of the Smithers airport. Nylon rope and cable ties were found nearby, and her shoes were never recovered. And I can't help but wonder if these were taken as a trophy, which is a classic serial killer move, or if they just disappeared. But everything else was there, including the weapons that were used. Just a few weeks later, 15-year-old Roxanne Thyara disappeared. Born in Manitoba but raised in Quesnel, BC, she'd been navigating foster care, addiction, and survival sex work. Like Ramona, Roxanne was just trying to change her life. She mentioned wanting to enter rehab, which is something that Ramona had mentioned as well. But on June 27, 1994, after returning to Prince George to collect her things, Roxanne disappeared. Heartbreakingly, her body was discovered nearly 2 months later, dumped near Burns Lake along the Highway of Tears. Police believe that she was actually killed elsewhere and then left near the roadside. Then, in December of that same year, Alicia Germain, also just 15 years old, was murdered. She also lived in Prince George and had endured a turbulent childhood. Like Roxanne, she'd spent some time on the streets and was vulnerable to sexual exploitation. But she, too, was trying to rebuild, determined to get clean and even to go back to school. On the night of December 9th, 1994, Alicia attended a Christmas party at the Native Friendship Center. She stepped out briefly and promised to return to pick up her Christmas gifts, but she never did. And her body was found that night behind Haldy Road Elementary School, just off the Highway of Tears. Alicia had been stabbed to death. Now, police did release a sketch and believed that they had a suspect, but they say that there's just not enough evidence to move forward with an arrest. They also recovered female DNA from the scene as well, but so far, it hasn't matched anyone in the system. These 3 absolutely horrific murders committed within just 6 months of each other, targeting girls with almost identical profiles in a confined geographic radius, are widely believed to be connected, right? So whether by a single perpetrator or by shared circumstances of vulnerability and neglect, they form a pattern that's just too obvious to ignore. In fact, as mentioned, they were the cases that finally pushed the RCMP to take action and to create Project EPANA. Former RCMP officer turned private investigator Raymond Falco has dedicated his life to investigating the unsolved cases along the Highway of Tears. After leaving the force, he began conducting his own pro bono investigation, which, mad props to him, one that has spanned hundreds of hours and has led him to develop a theory that he's been pretty vocal about. And that is that the murders of Alicia Germain and Roxanne Thyara may be tied to sex trafficking rings operating out of Prince George. Both Alicia and Roxanne had been confirmed as being involved in survival sex work at the time of their deaths. But what stood out most to Ray and what he believes is absolutely critical to understanding these cases is that both girls had recently expressed a desire to get clean and to leave the sex trade industry behind. That detail, he says, is more than just coincidence. This is what he said, quote, "It makes me wonder if the people responsible for running that business, using them like their pimps, had something to do with it," end quote. Meaning, obviously, perhaps, that someone didn't want these girls walking away and possibly exposing what they knew or what they were involved in or whatever. So they were silenced forever. He also believes that the killer may have lived near Haldy Road Elementary, the now abandoned school where Alicia's body was found. The location, he argues, was not random and suggests familiarity, proximity. Falco has a lot more to say on this topic and many other topics surrounding the Highway of Tears cases, and he eventually documented his findings and theories in a book titled Obstruction of Justice: The Search for Truth on Canada's Highway of Tears. So go check out that book for more info on what he has to say. When it comes to the other cases, those without a known suspect or clear connection to the others, there doesn't appear to be a consistent pattern. There's no visible victim profile, no identifiable MO, and nothing that definitively points to one perpetrator. The victims range in age from just 14 to 33. Causes of death vary, right? Some were beaten, others strangled, others died from blunt force trauma. In certain cases, there were signs of sexual assault, while in others there were none. Some remains were found in the open, while others were hidden for months or years. Some were found fully nude, while others were partially clothed. And some had only specific items of clothing missing at that, details that seem to raise questions but offer few answers. That said, to me, what that tells us is this. Either we're looking at multiple killers with different motives and methods, which that's where my money is, or one killer whose pattern is pure chaos. And if I had to bet, I'd say it's the former, multiple perps. And that concludes our heartbreaking journey of getting to know the 13 beautiful souls confirmed to have died by homicide along the Highway of Tears. And if that felt like a long time listening to me saying all of those names and recounting who they were in life and what happened to the extent I could, good. Let the impact hit while we also process the fact that this number is likely way under the mark when it comes to the actual victim count. Let's talk investigation. A man named Steve Pranzel, who initially joined the Vancouver Police Department in 1976, began taking a deeper look at some of the Highway of Tears cases in 2005. Investigators with major crimes experience were brought in to start reviewing all the cases, and by 2008, the task force really went into full swing. Let's turn our attention to a potential suspect whose name surfaced during the investigation, because you are never going to guess who appears on the suspect list. But I will give you a hint. He was a certain pig farmer with a slicked-back balding mullet, oddly good oral hygiene, and a penchant, whatever, for hiding inside the carcasses of gutted hogs. I am, of course, referring to none other than Robert Pickton. For any new listeners, we covered Robert Pickton, the homicidal pig farmer, in a two-parter back in March 2024. Crazy case, very detailed coverage. Give it a listen if you want to hate someone with every fiber of your being. And for those of you, obviously, who know who I'm talking about, can you believe that he makes an appearance here? I mean, we can't shake this guy. I'm going to give a little reminder here. Robert Pickton was charged with 26 murders, convicted only of 6, but is suspected of killing as many as 49 women. In fact, the search of Pickton's farm back in 2002 sparked what would become the largest forensic search in Canadian history, which we very thoroughly detailed. I cannot impress upon you enough to go back and listen to the two-part coverage of this guy, because it was an absolutely harrowing case. Although Pickton's crimes occurred primarily on his own farm near Port Coquitlam, south of Vancouver, rather than along the Highway of Tears, there have been theories suggesting that Robert Pickton may have traveled to or been involved in other areas, including northern British Columbia. However, law enforcement have not conclusively linked Robert Pickton to any of the unsolved cases along the Highway of Tears. That said, the broader context of violence against women, especially Indigenous women in Canada, ties Pickton's story to the wider issue of missing and murdered women across the country. Now, the investigation into the Highway of Tears cases has been challenging. Aside from the vastness of the Highway of Tears, as well as the density of the surrounding landscape, another challenge, if you will, in reinvestigating the cases was that the task force had to essentially acknowledge that their predecessors may have/did fuck up, drop the ball, or never even bother to run with it in the first place. According to Steve Pranzel, the longtime homicide detective with the VPD who later worked on the Highway of Tears task force, the quality of earlier investigations varied. I think that's putting it nicely. While some detectives and law enforcement agents did seem to put their best foot forward, others, arguably most, were quick to victim blame and to suggest that the girls were quote-unquote just runaways or in some way asking for what happened to them. Other investigators destroyed or threw out exhibits because they were just taking up space, like literally taking up office space. One such exhibit was a shirt thought to have blood on it, found in a rural area near where at least one of the girls disappeared. A cop apparently retrieved the shirt, but there was absolutely no record of it being collected. A man named Dr. Kim Rosmo, who was a geographic profiler on the Robert Pickton case, who we talked about at length in our coverage of Robert Pickton, and who was the first active duty cop in Canada to earn a PhD in criminology, which I think is really cool, made it very plain. Police move faster when the victim is seen as a quote-unquote true innocent. Translation, if you are poor, Indigenous, struggling with addiction or mental illness or work in the sex trade, your life doesn't seem to set off the same alarms. Here's the part that's really going to make your blood boil. Kim Rosmo warned them, and this is really in particular, like with respect to Robert Pickton, He saw the pattern, and they ignored him. And because of that silence, 23 more women disappeared before anyone bothered to care. Pop quiz. According to Steve Pranzel, what factor tends to influence whether or not police prioritize investigating a case? A, age of the victim. B, whether the victim's family shows interest. C, their skin tone. According to Steve Pranzel, the answer is B, whether or not the victim's family shows interest. According to Dr. Rosmo, another key factor that can elevate a case's priority is the presence of what's known as a cluster body site, or a single location where multiple victims are found. Finding one body in such a site often leads to others within just 50 meters, a pattern that's linked to serial offenders, which is why the theory of a serial killer became central to Project Ipana's investigation. Okay, so from here, the momentum picked up. Reports were published, new organizations were established to address the findings, and a wave of official responses followed. So I'm going to walk you through all of that next so that you can see how it all unfolded. It's really, really detailed, like in general, and there were a lot of different organizations that were developed. I'm going to kind of just run you through like the main ones, just to give you like a highlighted version. In 2004, Amnesty International released something referred to as Stolen Sisters, which was a damning report urging the Canadian government to protect Indigenous women and girls. It pulled no punches and claimed that for generations, government policies treated Indigenous people as tools to be assimilated, not citizens to be protected. Take the Indian Act. Enacted in 1876 and still in effect today, it gave the federal government sweeping control over nearly every part of Indigenous life: governance, land, education, even identity. It told bands how to operate. It decided who counted as Indigenous, and it was especially brutal to women. Indigenous women were literally legislated into second-class status. Marry a non-Indigenous man, you lost your status. Divorce, you could not return to your original band. Want to pass your status on to your children? Not unless the father had it. In other words, your identity on a woman hinged on a man. And without status, a woman lost her right to live on reserve, access treaty benefits, inherit family property, or even be buried with her ancestors. Let that sink in. A legal system that erased Indigenous women, stripped them of their rights, and punished them for who they loved. These weren't outdated flukes, mind you. Many laws weren't amended until 1985, and even then, the damage echoed. In 2019, the UN found the Indian Act still discriminated against Indigenous women and their descendants. So why does this matter? Because it shows how Canada's legal system laid the groundwork through bias, control, and erasure for the violence and neglect we see in cases like the Highway of Tears. This was not just policy, it was permission. Sticking to the timeline, in 2004, the Native Women's Association of Canada, or the NWAC, launched their own campaign to push authorities into action. And the Canadian government allocated $5 million to the initiative, but that was half of what was requested. And when that funding ran out 5 years later, the government refused to provide additional support. In June 2006, the Highway of Tears Symposium Recommendations Report was created by several Indigenous groups to raise public awareness and issue a call to action regarding safety along the Highway of Tears. Also in 2006, the Highway of Tears governing body was formed with a mission to implement the 33 recommendations from the Highway of Tears Symposium across 4 key areas: victim prevention, emergency readiness, victim family support, and community development. And lastly, in 2013, Human Rights Watch released an 89-page report titled "Those Who Take Us Away: Exposing the RCMP's Failure to Protect Indigenous Women in British Columbia." And this report did not just highlight neglect, it documented direct abuse. In 5 of 10 towns visited along the Highway of Tears, Indigenous women and girls reported being verbally harassed, physically assaulted, and even raped by law enforcement. The fear was so deep, it echoed the terror seen in post-conflict zones like Iraq, where police aren't protectors, but rather seen as predators. And it didn't start with patrol cars and missed 911 calls. For generations, the RCMP acted as agents of cultural erasure. They weren't just enforcing laws, they were quite literally tearing children from their families. In broad daylight, in the dead of night, no warning, no consent, just gone. Under the Indian Act, tens of thousands of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were ripped from their families and forced into residential schools, institutions designed not to educate but to annihilate identity, to literally, quote unquote, take the Indian out of the child. And the police were the muscle behind this. I received so many emails and DMs to touch upon this topic, so I'm glad to be doing it now. Which is why the Ojibwa word for police literally translates to mean the ones who take us away. This was cultural genocide carried out in uniform. So when people ask why Indigenous communities don't trust the police in Canada, the answer is simple. The trauma is generational. The wounds are still open, and the silence for far too long has been deafening. Okay, getting back to the case now in a more direct manner. RCMP acknowledged in a 2016 CBS News report that it may never find the killers responsible for the murders along the Highway of Tears from 1969 to 2006. More recent disappearances and murders along the Highway of Tears, however, do remain under active investigation. Efforts to improve safety along the highway have also continued. In 2023, a billboard campaign was launched along the road to honor the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and to raise awareness about the dangers of traveling along the highway alone. I think there was one billboard I remember seeing that literally says, "There's a murderer on the loose," like clear as day, so that any girl or woman or anyone looking to hitchhike might see that sign and think twice. The Ministry of Transportation pledged $10.2 million for improvements through 2024/25, which includes installing webcams, building bus shelters, and creating designated highway pullouts. Because one of the things I remember Ray, the investigator I talked about who does all this pro bono work for the Highway of Tears cases, I remember something in his book saying that what makes the Highway of Tears so incredibly dangerous in particular is that there's no way out. Like there's no pull-off roads. By December 2024, several new cell towers had been erected as well along the highway to improve cell coverage and to ensure emergency access for travelers. In conclusion, my dear beloved listeners, when we talk about the Highway of Tears, we are not just talking about missing persons. We are talking about a pattern, a pipeline of violence, a graveyard where women, largely Indigenous, were not/are not protected because they just aren't seen. Not as daughters, not as sisters, not as people worth saving. And until Canada fully reckons with that truth, not in theory, but in practice, the road stays bloody. And the tears, well, they will not stop falling. Women are still going missing or being found dead in this region. The tragedy is far from over, which means full justice and prevention remains unfinished work. I'd like to close out this episode with a poem that was written by 16-year-old Ramona Wilson, one of the victims who we talked about here today, who appeared on the list. Because beyond the headlines, beyond the statistics, she was a young girl with dreams, with a voice, with something to say. And I just think that ending with her words reminds us of who was lost and why we must keep fighting for justice. And this is what she wrote. As I look out to the bright blue sky this chilling autumn day, there's no way I can thank the Creator, no way to repay for the lovely sights to heart's content that He has let me see, for joys and laughter that I've lived and the love that He gave me. And that is the end of this episode. I just want to mention that a source that I used for this episode was a book titled Unbroken, My Fight for Survival, Hope, and Justice for Indigenous Women and Girls, written by Angela Sterrett, who's an award-winning investigative journalist and author. Thank you for allowing me to walk you through that. I think it is such an important case and such an important topic. And if you're here, that means you stuck by me, and I appreciate your ears and your heart and your support. But I do want to leave off on a palate cleanser because, I need one. So I'm sure you need one as well. Cash has literally been my emotional support dog throughout the research and development of this particular episode. He is like the story of my life. Is that dog is my world. But in particular, researching this case was a lot. It's historic in that it goes back and back and back. And it was a lot. And we actually recorded this in 2 sessions. And I had to work with Tony Tennessee, my producer, on gutting this and reworking it and chopping it and redoing so many elements of this because first of all, I put my heart into everything. So if I think something is not absolutely perfect, I want to redo it. That's number one. And number two, we both felt obviously that this needed to be executed really well, given the subject matter. You cannot believe how much went into this and how much I was in a state, right? Like, first of all, I'm very hard on myself on a good day, but let alone when I think like I'm not, whatever. I could be doing better. I go even harder on myself. But the one little creature who was there for me through it all, who made me feel like a rock star and number one, and like I could do no wrong, Cashy boy. He really, really got me through this episode. So if you enjoyed it, if you learned anything, you can basically thank him because I was pretty much going to walk off the ledge many, many times over. So thank you, Cash, for getting this episode out. Thank you, Tony Tennessee, for getting this episode out. And thank you most of all to you guys, to the listeners for giving us all a reason to want to do a good job and to want to work hard and to want to bring you content weekly that you enjoy and that's important to talk about. Thank you again for being here. If you want to follow me on socials and see a different side of me, go over to @InvestigatorSlater on Instagram and TikTok, @Psychopedia Pod, Instagram and TikTok. Of course, Patreon as well is a great place for us freaks to hang out. Patreon.com/PsychopediaPod. I love you all so much. I am grateful for each and every one of you. There is not a moment that goes by that I am not truly, truly grateful and loving every single one of you. And I can't wait to see you next week. Thanks. Thanks for listening. Bye.